Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Beth, and today I am here to bring you the next chapter in Wired for Story by Lisa Cron. We have been going through chapter by chapter, and today we are going to be discussing chapter 10. So let's get started. As always, we begin with a cognitive and a story secret. So let me read those to you very quickly. The first one is the cognitive secret. It says, since the brain abhors randomness, it's always converting raw data into meaningful patterns, the better to anticipate what might happen next. And our story secret is that readers are always on the lookout for those patterns. To your reader, everything is either a setup, a payoff, or the road in between. All right, so let's see what that means for us as writers. So, according to the neuroscientist that we've been following throughout this entire book, Antonio Damasio, the brain is a born cartographer. From the moment we leave the womb, it begins charting the patterns around us, and always with the same exact agenda, which is what is safe and what had I better keep my eyes on. So, stories are about the things we need to keep an eye on. Even the most mundane story has pieces in it that we have to watch. People that we know aren't trustworthy, narrators that might not be trustworthy, dangers unfolding from people, places, objects, the weather, whatever's going on, things that we need to keep our eye on. And so our brain is finding the patterns. They often begin the moment a pattern in the protagonist's life stops working. Scholars Chip and Dan Heath note the most basic way to get someone's attention is to break a pattern. So that's a good thing. But then the reader assumes that there's an interrelationship among all the facets of the story, that the patterns interlocked in the same way that ecosystems, borders, and jigsaw puzzles do. So what that means for us is that we had better have a reason for everything to be in there. We can't just randomly throw tidbits of information in and expect for readers to understand it and say, all right, well, that just doesn't have anything to do with the story, and push it to the side, because they're not gonna. For readers, we love setups, and anything that looks like a setup is going to need to be a setup because our brain is already checking out the possibilities that might be happening with this supposed setup. So, what exactly is a setup? I'm glad you asked. A setup is a piece of information that the reader needs in order to understand future instances, future actions. So this can be a fact, a person, an act, a mild wind blowing a certain smell, anything that might trigger a future action. And this gives the reader some information that they're going to have suspense building in the back of their mind with until the actual action happens. But you have to be careful with setups because you don't want to just throw something in their faces and say, here you go, this is what's happening now, so this can happen later. It needs to be subtle, it needs to build suspense. You don't need to just hit them over the head with it. Setups often lead us to new subplots, motives, and ways to interpret the story. So you have to make sure that your setup is a legitimate setup that is going to build suspense and lead your reader to the conclusions that bring them to these new ways of looking at things. Remember, readers believe that everything in a story is there on a need-to-know basis. So if you are putting information in that could be construed as a setup, they're going to believe that's what it's there for, and not that you just randomly wanted to include that little information and it has no bearing on the story. To help us get on the road from setup to payoff, Ms. Cron has included 3 rules for that road that all writers should know and think about as they're writing these. So rule number 1, there must actually be a road. This means don't piggyback your setup, which means don't learn about the problem right before the payoff or the solution happens. Don't tell the reader that little Billy Joe has been kidnapped 3 sentences before little Billy Joe is found safe and sound and handed back to his mommy. There needs to be setup, suspense, and then the solution further on down the line. Don't allow them to piggyback on one another. The readers will get very frustrated with that. Number 2, the reader must be able to see the road unfold. This means it cannot take place off of the page shrouded in secrecy. There are 3 reasons writers tend to keep the road between setup and payoff veiled, if not totally obscured. One is because they're saving it up for a big reveal, which we know we don't need to do. The second is they simply don't realize that they're doing it. They set up a promising storyline and then it's all happening in their mind and they don't realize that they are not setting it out on the page for the reader. And finally, writers sometimes inadvertently skip on the tells necessary to establish the pattern because, as I said, they're in our brain. And then finally, rule number 3, the intended payoff must not be patently impossible. Because the writer knows that something is going to happen to prevent the protagonist from taking more than a step or two down the particular path, they don't think about the fact that the reader isn't going to know right off the bat that it's not going to be a possibility for the protagonist. And so they'll think, oh no, why are they trying to make him do something impossible? He can't do that in the way the world has been set up. Since she knew that that wasn't going to work, the author didn't bother to worry with it too much and went on to the next one, didn't give all the details. But the reader will notice that the writer doesn't give the possibility of that happening, and then they are going to be frustrated with the story because, again, not enough detail. So you have to be careful with the way you do your setups and the paths, because if your protagonist cannot get through it, if you've set up an impossibility, you need to make sure that there are enough details so that the reader knows that the protagonist will not be trying to go down that path to the bitter end instead of just kind of leaving it set up like that and moving on. All right. And then she goes and discusses Die Hard a little bit, the setups and the payoffs throughout that movie. If you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it. I'm not going to go into details here, but one of the setups and payoffs that she discusses is at the beginning of the movie. He takes off his shoes in the bathroom, and then throughout the entire movie, he's running around barefoot. And there is a really good reason for him to take off his shoes and to be running around barefoot for the entire movie. And if you don't know what it is, you should check it out. It's great. And it gives us a very good setup and payoff, which I am not going to ruin for you if you've never seen that movie. But you should definitely check it out. It's one of my favorite action movies. And she does discuss in great detail why this is one of the most wonderful setups and payoffs that we've got going on in films right now, which is actually 3 years ago when this book was published. And I think she is very correct, so check that out. But now we're at the chapter 10 checkpoint. There are 4 of them, so here we go. Number 1, are there any inadvertent setups lurking in your story? Make sure nothing whispers, implies, or suggests a setup without actually meaning it. Remember, a great tool for ferreting out unintended setups is our old friend, the and so test, which we discussed in one of the previous videos. I believe it was chapter 9. Is there a clear series of events? This is number 2. Is there a pattern that begins the setup and culminates in the payoff? Are you absolutely sure none of your payoffs is piggybacking onto its setup? Equally important, are you sure there is an actual pattern of dots or tells leading from each setup to its payoff? I'm only halfway through with the one I'm writing right now, but I certainly hope so. I feel like the children's adventure story I just finished has that, but I haven't started the next revision yet, so I could be horribly mistaken. Number 3, do the dots build? If you connect the dots between the setup and the payoff, do they add up? Does a pattern emerge? Will your reader see the escalating progression and be able to draw conclusions from it and anticipate what might happen next? I certainly hope so. And finally, is the payoff of each of your setups logistically possible? Be sure to think each setup all the way through to its logical conclusion, especially those you know your protagonist won't take more than a step or two toward before circumstances force him to abandon it. Because otherwise, your readers aren't going to feel like your work is believable and will probably stop reading before they get to the point where your protagonist stops going down that road. And that's all I've got for you in chapter 10. We've got 2 more chapters and then we're done, guys. Thanks for sticking with me. I'll talk to you later. Bye.